Welcome to the COPD Foundation podcast. We bring you insights from leading health professionals, inspiring stories from those living with lung conditions, practical advice, and the latest in lung health research. Be sure to subscribe, follow us on social media, and visit copdfoundation.org. Take action today, breathe better tomorrow. Just a quick note before we jump into our topic. This podcast series was created for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for formal medical advice. Talk to your healthcare provider if you have any questions.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the COPD Foundation podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Karinko, a respiratory therapist and educator here at the COPD Foundation. Today, we're diving into a critical topic: how caregivers play a pivotal role in managing worsening COPD symptoms. We're joined by Dr. Trisha Parekh, who will share expert insights on how caregivers can help identify early signs of worsening COPD, and Margaret Baté, who will offer a personal perspective on the challenges and responsibilities of supporting a loved one with COPD. Together, we'll explore how caregivers can make a significant difference in preventing and managing worsening COPD. Let's get started.
So my name is Trisha Parekh. I am a pulmonologist and intensivist at the University of Texas in Austin at Dell Medical School. I also am a physician scientist, so I do research specifically in COPD patients, mostly focused on understanding the mechanisms between chronic stress, social disadvantage, and adverse health outcomes, including exacerbations. And currently, I'm actually conducting a clinical trial that is looking at a yoga breathing protocol to see if that improves symptoms and reduces stress for COPD patients.
My name is Margaret Baté. I have lived in Houston, Texas, for over 3 decades. I was born in Cameroon in West Africa. I am a health educator and a caregiver.
Thank you both so much for joining us. So, Dr. Parekh, I'll start with you. Can you tell me a little bit about the key signs that you see when a patient with COPD is having more symptoms above their baseline and the caregiver's role in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as a caregiver, the changes that you'll notice are going to be subtle at first. And, you obviously know your loved one best, which is why, the input that we get from caregivers as a physician is so great, because we really can identify when someone is starting to decline early on. But from a caregiver standpoint, you may notice that they are less active. They may be a little bit more withdrawn, not wanting to do social activities because they know that their breathing is harder and heavier. You may notice that they are using their rescue inhalers more, or that they're more breathless when they're doing activities that they normally wouldn't get breathless with, like eating or showering or getting dressed or even having conversations. You may notice that they're starting to take, more frequent and more deep breaths. And, oftentimes I do think that caregivers are, really good at noticing these subtle changes before the patient is aware of it themselves or willing to be vocal about it and seek help for it.
So, Margaret, your perspective as the caregiver, you're the one who has this outside perspective. You're able to see when there's a change because they're living with their symptoms every day. So what kind of tricks do you have in your tool belt to be able to monitor when their symptoms are becoming a little less controlled, a little bit more serious, that that it's time that they need to contact someone and get extra help for their symptoms?
It is so important to recognize the breathing pattern. Living with COPD, breathlessness, it comes with it. But as a caregiver, you get to the point where you monitor their breathing and also their vital signs. their vital signs. When you take their vital signs, and if you've been keeping record, or if you've been taking care of this person, you get used to see when it kind of goes the other way. And then you say, we don't want to wait until we are at that last phase where you really, really can't breathe anymore. Also, their mood change, because as the breathing becomes difficult for the person with COPD, as a caregiver, you will notice their mood will change because they start panicking. Again, with COPD, one of the primary signs is to seek medical attention is shortness of breath and fatigue, shortness of breath. While my loved one experienced shortness of breath as a baseline symptom, it became more concerning when the ability to perform everyday activities declined. So again, their mood change, how their activities of daily living, how are they able to, how much has changed, are they still functioning today, this afternoon, like they were doing in the morning? Because sometimes they too they feel like they don't want to, even the caregiver. So but you have to get to that point where you get them to trust you that it is okay, and monitor for any changes also in their cough and increase in the mucus production. Sometimes also their oxygen might decrease for those of them who are on oxygen. You go back to the toolbox. What do I do when the oxygen has decreased? What is it the medical team suggested we do or prescribe? And that's what used to help us.
So, Dr. Parekh, what role do caregivers play in making sure that people who are experiencing those more severe symptoms and might be coming on with an exacerbation, that they receive timely care? I'm sure that they don't want to overstep, but as a caregiver, your role is to advocate for the person that you care for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, every COPD patient ideally should have an action plan that is discussed with their healthcare provider in case symptoms do worse. And caregivers, actually, in my opinion, should be the ones who are, familiar with the plan, or even more familiar with the plan, so that they can take action ahead of time to prevent an ER visit or a hospitalization. So definitely understanding what the action plan is with the provider, having phone numbers available for their physician or their nurse practitioner. It would be really helpful for caregivers to help ensure that patients don't run out of their medications, right? Because that's really unfortunate when someone is out of their medication and that's the reason that they're starting to have an exacerbation. And then finally, to just take action when you do notice a change in breathing. I think a big key for every provider, and of course for every patient too, is to prevent that ER visit or that hospitalization. And a lot of timely intervention in the beginning of an exacerbation can be really helpful in preventing them. So I think, calling the physician's office ahead of time would be really important. And then I do want to emphasize that I think this kind of monitoring and awareness is especially important if your loved one lives alone. So we do know that elderly patients have, such high rates of loneliness, anxiety, and depression. A lot of this, I think, does come from social isolation. And of course, their kids get busy with their own kids and their own lives. And so if you don't, live with your loved one who has COPD, call them daily, check in on them, do drop-bys on the weekend to visit them, go to appointments with them. All of this stuff really does make a difference.
So When you started taking care of your dad, did you get any training or guidance from any healthcare workers or healthcare providers, doctors, anything, nurses, on how to help manage COPD in the home?
Yes, indeed. I was fortunate that as a health educator, and I was active in the community where I did health fairs, and I had the opportunity. At the time, we didn't know it was COPD, but when yes, I had to receive guidance. I received guidance and training from healthcare providers on how to manage COPD at home, especially. I was shown how to detect the early signs of exacerbation, which to explain to my dad, because we had several conversations. I would tell him, I said, Papa, it's flare-ups. That's, when you feel, when you get into that mode, it's your flare-ups. And use. I was also taught on how to use the inhalers, help him to use his inhalers and other prescribed medications correctly, and understand the importance of regular monitoring his symptoms regularly. That was very helpful. Also, through my own research, I discovered that breathing exercises, such as the pulse sleep breathing, that was what was popular back then, over a decade ago, can help to improve airflow and reduce the shortness of breathing. So that's what was really helpful. At first, when I tried to teach my dad about it, and he was like, child, what are you talking about? He didn't think it, it was, that was what was going to help him better than the medications that he had. But Johnny, I have to tell you, I felt um I felt a team player with him. One day when he sat me down, he would call me mommy. He said, Mommy, let me tell you, I know when that illness is going to happen. I said, what do you mean? He was okay. He said, I know when it's coming. I said, how do you know? He said, I know. And do you know we haven't gone back to the hospital for some few days because he has been practicing that breathing technique. And when I walked away from him, I could just feel the weight, that when I tell him, Papa, breathe, do the pulse sleep breathing, now he knows it's a tool that we can use when he is in that situation.
So, for someone who is newly coming into the role of a caregiver, what advice would you give them? Tips on what to look for to start monitoring if they really haven't experienced COPD before?
Yeah, great question. I think that, with a lot of patients that come to see me in clinic for a COPD evaluation, they usually have never heard of COPD before. They really don't understand what it is. And so when they come alone, I think it's difficult for them to absorb all of that information and then go home and tell a caregiver, exactly what they've been diagnosed with and, what they should expect from having COPD. So I would recommend that first and foremost, a caregiver takes the time to really educate themselves on what COPD is, understand what the signs and symptoms are for a typical progression of COPD, the signs and symptoms of an exacerbation, become familiar with some of the treatments for COPD as well. I think all of that can be really helpful for a new caregiver and, of course, for their loved one. The second thing is, I think in order for a caregiver to be able to really identify that somebody is starting to have worsening of symptoms, they really need to understand what their baseline is. So when we're talking about an exacerbation, we're talking about an acute change in symptoms from their baseline. So somebody, may be having a cough daily and producing sputum. They may be using their rescue inhaler 3 or 4 times a day, and that could be their baseline. But for someone who normally doesn't have a cough, normally never reaches for their rescue inhaler, and now they're all of a sudden having a bad cough, using their rescue inhaler multiple times, that's going to be, an indication that they're declining and they need to seek treatment. So I think really understanding what COPD is and then understanding, the baseline symptoms that your loved one has can be really helpful at understanding when they're going through a decline.
What I would recommend is to have a comprehensive checklist to track the vaccinations. Vaccinations are very important for people who have COPD. Also, their medications, what type of medications, and also other essential health markers. I say that because people who have COPD, there's a tendency they have other chronic health issues. It was with my father. And back then, it used to take a long time to diagnose them with COPD. Also, to have access to pulmonary rehabilitation programs, which sometimes include nutritional recommendations for individuals depending on also their different stages of COPD. You don't want to wait until they are getting worse. It's good to put in place those techniques. I call it techniques, so that you prepare yourself either to delay going to the next stage, or if you get to the next stage, what do? We know now that all the literatures is telling us that COPD still does not have a cure, but the treatment will delay. And these days, people with COPD can live longer. I have to share with you again, Johnny, that when my father was diagnosed with COPD during one of many trips to the emergency room. I can still remember vividly when the doctor walked into my father's emergency room, and I was sitting there by my father's bed, and she looked at me and said, "What type of COPD does he have?" And I was like, what? That was over a decade ago. And at the time, I had never heard about COPD. And what happened, my immediate response was, what is COPD? And none of his doctors, he had multiple chronic conditions, and we went to all his appointments. He had wonderful doctors and nurses, but they had not figured out that his breathing problem he was having breathing problem because he had COPD. Coincidentally, as my dad was admitted during that trip, and we go into his room. As we entered this room, there was a COPD ad on the TV in his room. And that was the first time I sat there and I listened. And that was the turning point for me. As a caregiver, I felt compelled to learn everything I could about this disease. For years, I had wondered, is this you, Papa? Because when he would exacerbate, he becomes a different Papa. And I would wonder, is this you, Papa? In fact, there's a fire station not too far from us. They almost knew our house by, I want to say, if there was a special ringtone on their phone, because of how many times they will come. Will come back from the hospital within 72 hours, it's happening again. That's because they had not diagnosed him properly that it was COPD for him to be on the right treatment. But he was on some inhalers for other situations that they thought it was. And what happened is that I made it my mission to understand how to provide him with the best possible care. This is how I discovered the invaluable resources from the COPD Foundation. Back in the days, my advice to other caregivers is that there is more hope today for people living with COPD. There's more resources available for caregivers. Thanks to the advancement in modern medicine, patients are living longer and managing their daily activities more effectively. While COPD still has no cure, there are numerous treatment options available, as well as a wealth of resources, including, again, like we said before, pulmonary rehabilitation, nutritional guidance, vaccines, education, and support groups. We have to empower our loved ones by helping them manage their condition, reducing indoor triggers, encouraging them to stay socially engaged, whether with families, friends, or a church group, while ensuring their safety always. My father was almost 100 years old, but he knew on Fridays, his church group meets on Fridays. He will take extra rest during the daytime. And there were Fridays when he said, "Mommy, I can't go today." I won't force him. But when he said he will go, he arrives there and people will be happy. But I will be cautious also, the environment, to kind of eyeball and just have a feel. Is it a safe environment tonight for Papa to be here? And we have had this thing where I could tell him, I say, "Papa, I don't think this evening, this night, we need to spend long time here." Seems as if somebody has a call, with that being, don't wanting to be judgmental. Or if I see his mood is changing, I go to him and we leave the place. But what I'm trying to say is that it is good to encourage them to do some of those activities. And as a caregiver, remember that you are not alone. It is always good to remember that you are not alone, to not hesitate to seek help.
So, Dr. Parekh, in your experience, how can caregivers assist in helping to prevent exacerbations by promoting healthy habits and environmental changes?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, I love this question because I am all about preventive care. So we know that there are some basic elements to healthy living for really any individual, right? Like exercise, healthy eating, social interaction, and avoiding risky behaviors. I think probably the most important that everyone would agree on is if your loved one is smoking, helping them to quit smoking. Of course, every patient that has COPD already knows that smoking is harmful. They've heard that smoking is harmful several times. They all know that they need to quit. Most of them, I do feel like they want to quit, right? But it's so difficult because it's a habit or because their lives are actually extremely stressful. And it is their only source of coping. So when my patient has made the decision to quit, I tell them to tell their spouse, tell their kids, tell their any type of caregiver, tell their friends, anyone, just to help them keep accountable. Because then you have this, group of people that's rallying behind them, that's helping them, on this journey to quit smoking once and for all. So it is an incredibly difficult task to do, and I think it can be made slightly easier when you have a lot of people supporting you. And so I think that's something that caregivers can be really helpful in. Next, of course, for every COPD patient, exercise, some form of movement daily is really important. So I tell all my patients to, if you can, just walk 20 to 30 minutes at your own pace daily. The ones who are consistently doing that are those that have someone walking with them. Generally, it's their spouse or their child that comes with them, or they have a dog that they, take, but just somebody or some being to keep them company and to keep them accountable. It's much more likely that they'll get those steps in. So if you can, go on walks with your loved one who has COPD, or if you don't live with them, make it a point to visit them on the weekends and go for an extra long walk. I think that can be really helpful. I think another thing that sometimes does get overlooked, especially during the holidays, is social distancing when people are sick. So, a lot of patients with COPD who are elderly, many of them have grandkids. Many of them adore their grandkids, but their grandkids have, a lot of infections going on in and out. And so those simple colds that come and go with kids linger much longer in patients who have COPD and can get quite severe. So I really encourage caregivers or children of people who have COPD to make sure to be really, really strict about, not letting anyone who's sick come around your loved one, and just really keeping that distance, because that's really important. And, holidays will come again, but we just want to make sure that no one gets sick unnecessarily. And then regarding the environment, I think that now we know a lot more about how hazardous our environment is, particularly with exposure to indoor and outdoor air pollution. There's a lot more research that is, coming out with regards to what we can do to kind of prevent our exposure. So, I think there's some kind of simple things. Of course, I would, avoid smoking around your loved one. I think that that's pretty common knowledge. Wear a face mask if you are in a place that has known high pollution levels. Like I said, I encouraged walking, generally walking outside, but, choose walking near less busy roads, or, use kind of your local air prediction or air quality predictions like the AQI on the weather app to determine if it is safe to go outside. And then, with regards to indoors, I would use a vacuum cleaner to clean, or use a wet cloth instead of like a broom or a duster that's going to just have more of the dust kind of fly up in the air. I would, avoid chemicals in a lot of the different cleaners that can exacerbate symptoms. Avoid burning candles in the home, because that we know isn't really great for your lungs either. And then, if there are times of the day that, don't have kind of high levels of traffic, then, open up the windows and get some ventilation in the house as well. So some of these kind of simple things that we can do to help limit our exposures can be helpful in the long run.
So Margaret, how do you control any stress or anxiety or fear that you have related to being a caregiver? And how do you take care of yourself so that you can take care of someone else? And then Dr. Parekh, I'm curious to hear your thoughts and advice for caregivers in our community as well.
How do I manage that? It's a good question, because there are times when you think you have it all under control, and that exacerbation kicks in. Let's say now on my father, and you find yourself, you have to communicate if it means going to the hospital with the emergency team, and you have to hope that they get there early enough to rescue the situation. How do I manage that? I reach inside me and use the toolkit and just tell myself, Margaret, stop. You have to follow A, B, C, D. How is their breathing? What's their vital signs? and what medications do they need to take now. Go back to that toolkit, go back to that toolbox. And in that toolbox, you have to go in and take one at a time so that you keep the situation under control by doing that, by using your toolkit. And later on, after I had moments where even in the hospital, when everything is under control, I will walk out sometimes on the hallway and I'll cry. It's okay to cry. He's my father. I'm the caregiver. And even though he was elderly, I did not want to lose him, even though he's up there now. And it can be very stressful, as much as we caregiver want to do everything right, especially for the person who has COPD. There are many times I went out to the hallway and I cried. And we were fortunate. There were 2 hospitals that we used. It had gotten to the point where they knew us there because we were always coming back, that the doctors and the nurses were really good. I allowed myself to cry. And I was fortunate also. I am fortunate that I have a large family between my brothers and their wives and my daughters. There were times I had promised Papa, we are never going to leave you alone in the hospital or at home. So we were always there with him. So I would use their shoulder also. The other thing with caregiving, we don't know how to accept help. We always think we can handle it. We don't think of ourselves. When it hits us that in order to take care of the person that we're taking care of, we must take care of ourselves also. We do it, but we don't do it often. We have to be reminded. So it's okay to accept help. It's okay to say, yes, I can use your help.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is probably, probably one of the most important points, right? Being a caregiver is extremely tough. It's really hard work. Doesn't matter how much you love your loved one, being in charge of another human being and their health is really tough. And so, I would encourage you, as the saying goes, you can't pour from an empty cup. So encourage you to do the things that make sure that you are taking care of your own health, both physical and mental, so that you are able to, caregive for someone that you love. Oftentimes when the role of caregiver is placed on one person, I think that can be an extremely stressful position to be in. Really, it should be the role of caregivers, and it should be a village that is helping to take care of this one person. So whether it is, utilizing a community health worker or, a sibling or a grandkid, but other people that can really come together to learn more about COPD and, how your loved one is managing their COPD, and you can collectively take care of this person, that can really limit some of the stress and the burden on a single caregiver. And so, so definitely, I think take care of yourself. It's really important, and your loved one wants you to be healthy too, and wants you to be around for as long as you can. So, definitely keep that as a priority.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the COPD Foundation podcast. We hope that this conversation has highlighted the importance of caregiver support and provided useful strategies for recognizing and acting on worsening COPD symptoms. A heartfelt thanks to Dr. Parekh and Margaret for sharing your expertise and experience on the vital role that caregivers play in managing COPD. If you found today's conversation helpful, be sure to subscribe and share with others who could benefit. For more information about COPD and other chronic lung conditions, visit the COPD Foundation website at www.copdfoundation.org. Thank you for tuning in. Be on the lookout for more episodes where we delve into all things respiratory. Take action today, breathe better tomorrow.
Thank you for tuning into the COPD Foundation podcast. And remember, whether you're managing a chronic lung condition, providing support to those who are, or just want to learn more about lung health, the COPD Foundation is here to support you. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and follow us on social media. Take action today, breathe better tomorrow.